Teruan Saranai. Welcome to another Poya, today being POSON Poya. So welcome to this Dhamma session. So today's session, we're looking at this statement, what makes us incapable of realizing Nibbana? Or in other words, what makes us incapable of escaping from samsāra? And the sutta that we're studying today is actually the Tayodhamma Sutta, which is in the Anguttara Nikāya, chapter 10, discourse number 76. And it actually gives us a really nice overview of some of the things that we've been looking at over the past few years, and in particular the last year of our sort of sutta studies and developing the Noble Eightfold Path. So what we're going to cover today is this sutta has a lot of Dhamma in it. And so there's less or no meditation in this session, but a lot of Dhamma concepts. And they're not all new, as we'll see as we get into the actual sutta itself. But we'll start with our usual tips and reminders, then we'll do an introduction into the Tayodhamma Sutta, looking at how the architecture of the sutta, a bit of an overview and context for it. And then we'll launch into the Buddha's opening statement and then look at the actual Dhamma in this sutta. And it's really looking at 30 main Dhammas, 30 main qualities or characteristics, and then they're opposing 30 qualities and characteristics. So 30 are unwholesome and 30 are more wholesome when you abandon them. And then we'll look into these groupings of 3, because this sutta is really around groups of 3 and how they prevent us, make us incapable of uprooting and escaping from samsāra. So that's what we're going to do. And then lastly, we'll look at some of the insight pathways, some of the ñāṇapathā. And it's actually quite deep. Like when you start investigating and contemplating, there are many layers. And so for someone new to the Dhamma, it's can be a little bit overwhelming. But for us, in terms of those that are already training, then it's not so difficult because we're familiar. But the main thing is to get this big snapshot, this panoramic view of where Buddha is coming from. And some of the things that we've been studying start to make sense. And then we'll have some questions at the end. So to begin, as usual, when we're listening to the Buddha's words, we're looking at, the different aspects of Dhamma. Keep an open mind. We may not understand everything, which is quite okay. So today there may be a few things that might fly over our heads, but at the same time, be okay with it. Whatever you can understand, that's very good enough. And remember that, we're all learning on this path. So this is always an encouragement. Whatever we discuss or hear today, it's always an encouragement from the Buddha, and each of us is here to learn. And then in terms of the Buddha's words, as you're listening, as we remember, Buddha says, listen with eager ears. So listen in order to almost like connect the dots to what we've heard before, what we're practicing, and how it applies to that, how it fits in, because this sutta is very much about how things fit in. So when we do that, sometimes what might happen is examples come to the mind, or there might be examples that are outlined today. And so you think about, does that apply? How does that fit? And then lastly, of course, we have good wishes for everyone. It's not easy to come and listen to Dhamma. And we'll see this also, how that fits in the Tayodhamma Sutta today. And, we need a lot of metta, karuna, in order for the Dhamma to go in order for us to calm the mind, really. Calm the mind and put away, the things that are troubling us, outside of this session, just put them down, whether they're to do with, our families, our schoolwork, our work itself, all kinds of things that are affecting us, in our community. And so we give ourselves this time period together, to come together, to practice, to learn, and to honor the Buddha, so we can begin. Okay, so we'll begin with the introduction to the Tayodhamma Sutta. And what you'll see is that this is a very important sutta. There's much to learn from this sutta, and it's probably one that you'll continue to refer to moving forward, because there's a lot of qualities and characteristics that we want to abandon, and we don't know how to do it, but this gives some context for it. And there's also things that we want to cultivate, and you'll see that as well when we start to look at some of these Dhammas. So in a nutshell, Buddha explains in this sutta, there are these unwholesome things that prevent us from escaping samsāra, that keep us bound to the continual rebirth. And then he explains, how can we abandon, these things in order to realize Nibbana, at least, walk in that path to actually realize Nibbana. And so with this sutta, what we'll see is that you get this bigger picture and the context of what we are actually doing on the Dhamma path. And right into the detail, when you start to meditate on this sutta, you start to unlock certain things. And hopefully during this session, you'll get a glimpse of that. You'll get a glimpse of how we have been unlocking certain things and how we will continue to do so using, many of these Dhammas. In many ways, you could say that this sutta is really Dhammānupassana. So we're actually contemplating different aspects of Dhamma. And we're trying to open it up to make sure we have right view, make sure we start to see some of the places we can't see, where we get locked, where we get stuck, where we still have wrong view, And so this is a way of looking at that. So the architecture, it's always good to look at, how's this teaching from the Buddha constructed? And so Buddha begins with an opening statement and says that a Buddha arises in the world and the teaching and training shines in the world due to three things. And so we'll come to that. And then part 2 is essentially, he goes through the 10 sets of things in threes. And so that gives you the 30 Dhamma characteristics or qualities. And those are the ones, the initial part, this part 2 is the initial part that Buddha says, this is what makes us incapable of escaping samsāra. These are the things that make us, make it impossible to realize Nibbana. And then the last part of the sutta is, all the things, the 10 sets of three things, so 30 again, that make us capable of escaping samsāra and realizing Nibbana. So that's essentially what the sutta looks like. It looks pretty simple when you look at it like this, but when you get into the detail, then you start to understand, oh, there's a whole lot more in there. So the overview. So as we know, this is a teaching from the Buddha, and we get like this bird's eye view, so to speak, about the teaching. And so the Buddha opens with a statement that says, if three things did not exist in the world, then the Buddha would not arise in the world, the teaching and training proclaimed by the Buddha would not shine in the world. And then he talks about these 30, unwholesome elements. And within these unwholesome elements, this incapacity that we have, it's really looking at samudaya. Like these are the arising of the things that make it impossible for us to realize Nibbana. So these are, if we cultivate these unwholesome things, we are tied to samsāra, we're subject to old age, sickness, and death, because we keep being reborn. And so we encounter the whole mass of suffering again. So this is rooted in lobha, dosa, moha. So rooted, in this case, the sutta refers to raga instead of lobha, but similar thing. So lust or greed, and then hatred and delusion. And then the second part is, if we abandon these 30 unwholesome things, grouped in threes, then we're capable, we have the capacity, the ability to escape samsāra and realize Nibbana. So this is the athangama side of it, the passing away, that this is, if we cut off at the root, lust or greed, hatred and delusion, if we uproot greed, hatred and delusion, so this is the alobha path, the adosa path, and moha path, then It's possible to realize Nibbana. So the context for this sutta, as has been mentioned, is that it gives a very useful bird's eye view, a useful snapshot of this bigger picture, because the Buddha begins by saying that the Buddha doesn't arise in the world because of jati, jara, marana, because of birth, aging, and death. So when you start with this predicament, you realize the Buddha's teaching is always about this, that this is what we always have to remember. And if you remember, the first noble truth of suffering, it's always jati pi dukkha, jara pi dukkha, vyādi pi dukkha, and marana pi dukkha. So this is our predicament. And so in order to be free, we need to look at certain things. So what's lovely about this sutta is that it enables us to see how things fit together. So what we studied last Poya, so for Vesak, we looked at Yoniso Manasikara, and you see how that fits in today. We also have looked at stream entry in the Velubhariya Sutta and various other suttas attached to that. We also see how that fits today, and that will be quite interesting to talk about. Also, the numerous defilements, hindrances, and even when we were looking at the Sekapatipada, some of the qualities as trainees, like our mode of progress, how do we make progress? Many of these qualities appear within these 60 elements. And so you start to get that picture. So when we look at it, you'll start to see what I mean. So for this session, what we're going to do is we're going to look at an initial look at this sutta. So we're not going to go too deep. It's more of a broad overview, a bit of an understanding about the Pali words, a bit of an understanding about the groups of threes. And then from there, if we want to have another session to go deeper into some of these things, it's possible. But I think for this first glimpse, it's good to keep it broad and have a look at it, get a feel for it. And the most important takeaway is probably that when you come away from this session, you'll probably realize that we need to actually deeply investigate these Dhammas and thoroughly contemplate them. So for some of them, we've probably done a little bit already, and for others, not so much. But then there's also multiple insight pathways in this teaching. So this is something that's very interesting, because you start to see how Lobha is constructed, how Dosa is constructed, and how Moha is constructed. So the greed, the hatred, delusion. Then you also will see how do you deconstruct Lobha, Dosa, Moha. So that becomes the Alobha, Dosa, Moha, non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion. And one other thing that may arise by listening to this teaching is that there are links, there are similarities to other suttas. So for example, there is similarity to the Avijja Sutta, the one on ignorance in Anguttara Nikāya, chapter 10, discourse 61. And sometimes we try and compare and say, oh, why does it fit that way, particularly with the ñāṇapathā. But the most important thing to remember is that Buddha gives very distinct teachings and for very specific purposes. So for the Avijja Sutta, as an example, the Avijja Sutta is purely about understanding how ignorance is constructed. Whereas with this one, in terms of Tayodhamma Sutta, very much how we're not able to abandon birth, aging, and death. So it's slightly different focus. They're similar component parts, but they may not have the pathway exactly the same. And so you don't want to compare and then get confused. So the main thing with this to take away is just stick to the insight pathways bespoke to each sutta. It's safer that way. And then you also understand where the Buddha is coming from. Because as we know, the Buddha often gets questioned by different people, so Brahmins, the monks and nuns, different lay people. And so he gives a teaching based on that question, who the audience is and what is the purpose and what he sees in the person that he's talking to. So we just need to bear that in mind. So we're only going to look at these two words because this is the main thing about the Tayodhamma is ababo or baba and baba, babo, baba. So the first one means incapable. So this is where the beginning of the sutta begins, and Buddha talks about we're incapable, ababa. And when this word is used, it could also mean impossible. So we're incapable of realizing certain things, where it's impossible for us to do so. We're not able to, we're unfit to, it's unlikely, and we're not proficient. So these are the types of things that are attributed to. This is how, in this instance, we're going to use incapable. And babbo or babba is used as capable. So it's possible for us. If we contemplate certain things in a particular way, it becomes possible. We're able to. The ability is there. We're fit to do so. And it's likely, and we become proficient. So this is in relation to the spiritual path, that in terms of wanting to escape from rebirth, aging and death, and the whole mess of suffering, we need to know what characteristics and qualities we need to cultivate, and which are the ones that we need to abandon. Those are the ones that make us incapable. And so when you hear in different suttas, Buddha says, oh, it's incapable if you lack conviction, like saddha, you lack hiri, as in the sense of shame. You realize this is what the Buddha is referring to, that it makes us incapable of leaning towards Nibbana, incapable of uprooting what is rooted in greed, hatred, and delusion. So the beginning of the sutta starts with this statement. Mendicants, if three things were not found, the realized one, the perfected one, the fully awakened Buddha, would not arise in the world, and the teaching and training proclaimed by the realized one would not shine in the world. What three? Birth, old age, and death. If these three things were not found, the realized one, the perfected one, the fully awakened Buddha would not arise in the world, and the teaching and training proclaimed by the realized one would not shine in the world. But since these three things are found, the realized one, the perfected one, the fully awakened Buddha arises in the world, and the teaching and training proclaimed by the realized one shines in the world. So this is Buddha's broad statement at the beginning, that the Buddha wouldn't come to be, the teaching and the discipline wouldn't come to be or shine in the world without birth, old age, and death. And because birth, old age, and death exists, then the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the training exists. So this is the opening statement. So this table that we're looking at now gives us a summary of part 2. So this is a summary of what makes us incapable of escaping samsāra. So we are bound to birth, aging, and death. And so when you look at this table, you see things that you're already familiar with. You know, this is the formula for staying in samsāra. But you see things that we've looked at as seekers. So you see, for example, the lack of shame. This is here. Lack of moral shame. We've looked at this in the INCAPABLE Sutta, Nāṇapathā Sutta. We see no fear of wrongdoing. We've looked at this again in the INCAPABLE Sutta. Negligence. We've looked at that in the Pamāda Vihāri Sutta. When it comes to difficult to instruct, Duvaca Sutta, this is the same or similar to Duvaca. So this is Anumana Sutta. Avijja Sutta, we've been looking at having, bad friends, like associating with bad persons, like asapurusas. We've looked at lack of conviction, so asaddha. We've seen this in, Sekapatipata and other suttas. We've looked at this, including Avijja Sutta. Avadanyutta, we've looked at in terms of Atupama Sutta. This is really like stinginess, lack of generosity is stinginess. Then restlessness, we've seen as a hindrance. So it's a nibbana. Dusila we know as being, dasa akusala. So we lack virtue by body, speech, and mind. Asangvara we've seen also in the Avijja Sutta, but we've also seen this in terms of our karaniya metta. What we want is santindriyo. We want to have indriya sangvara, same as being apamada, being vigilant. We have this security guard. And then if we come further down, we're familiar with forgetfulness. So this is the lack of sati. We're also familiar with asampajanya. We look at this in the Avijja Sutta. Last session for Vesak, we looked at yoniso manasikara and ayoniso manasikara. So we spent a whole long session meditating and understanding what is this important way to direct the mind. And before that, we looked at this whole section here row number 2, we've looked at stream entry. So we've looked at, what's needed, what needs to be abandoned, which fetters are needed to be abandoned to overcome, to that which blocks stream entry. So identity view, doubt, and misapprehension of virtue and observances. So you see, there are many things here that we've seen before. So there are only a few that we haven't. So this disrespect, anadarya, kosajja. We haven't spent a lot of time looking at kosajja, which is the indolence. When it comes to no wish to see noble ones, no wish to hear noble Dhamma, fault-finding mind, this is relatively new, but it's understandable what these things are. And we'll go through these things in more detail when we get into the detail of each group of 3. And then you have these terms here: mental disturbance, cetaso vikapa, and cetaso linatam, mental sluggishness. And when we go through this will be very interesting as well. What happens to the mind when we're cultivating the wrong things? Certain things start to fall together, better understood when we look at this. So this is really interesting because you start to see how things fit together when you look at this. One thing to say is that Buddha is definitely encouraging good quality. So he's not encouraging any of these, but it's important to know what is the samudaya. Like, how do we keep coming back? Is because we keep doing these unwholesome, cultivating unwholesome qualities and virtues. And the Noble Eightfold Path, for example, it gets cultivated when we start to abandon these 30 elements. Because instead of cultivating unwholesome qualities, we're cultivating the wholesome ones. And if we cultivate the ñāṇapathā, then again it activates the Noble Eightfold Path. So essentially, this column, first column here, is lobha path. This is lobha, raga, lobha, same thing. And this path here is dosa. Okay, the second column is dosa. And then the third column is moha, which you can really see from the bottom here, row number 1, lobha, dosa, and moha, or raga, dosa, moha, same thing. So very interesting. So when we look at the opposite, it becomes alobha, adosa, amoha. So the non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion. And when you start to develop the wholesome path, you start to develop all the different qualities that also aid enlightenment, so aid Nibbana. So it'd be like the spiritual faculties, the bojjhangas, the iddhipadas, the balas, satipatthana, the padanas. It all starts to come together once you start abandoning these things. But while you still cultivate these things, it makes it very difficult to develop the things that help one to realize Nibbana. We're going to take a closer look. So not to worry if some of this is, wow, that's a lot of Dhamma, but we're going to look at this gradually and sequentially, and it will become a little bit clearer. So what the Buddha says in the sutta is that without abandoning birth, aging, and death, we are, without abandoning 3 things, we are unable to abandon birth, aging, and death. And so what are those 3? Well, it's lust, hatred, and delusion. So that's what the Buddha says. So you cannot give up. You cannot abandon birth, aging, and death unless you give up greed, hatred, and delusion. And then the Buddha goes on to say, without having abandoned another 3 things, you can't give up greed, hatred, and delusion. And so what are those 3 things? Well, they're the 3 fetters: identity view, doubt, and misapprehension of virtue and observances, sakkaya ditthi, vicikicca, and silabbata paramasa. And then the Buddha goes on to say, you can't give up these 3 fetters unless you abandon 3 other things. And so what are those 3 other things? So it's ayoniso manasikara, is unwise contemplation, following the wrong path, kumaka sevana, and this mental sluggishness, cetaso linatam. And then the Buddha says, without having abandoned 3 things, you can't give up these 3 things. You can't give up unwise contemplation, wrong path, and the mental sluggishness. So what 3? And so then the Buddha says, well, it's muddhasaccam, forgetfulness, asampajanyam, lack of clear comprehension, and then cetaso vikapa, mental disturbance or being upset, having an upset mind, confusion. And so then the Buddha says, you can't give up these 3 unless you give up another 3. And so what are those three? You don't wish to see the noble ones, so ariyanam, adasana, kamyatam. And then no wish to hear the noble Dhamma, arya dhammasa, asoto kamyatam. And then you have the fault-finding mind, the supercritical mind, so the uparamba chittatam. And so you can't abandon these three things unless you abandon a further three. And so what are those three? It's restlessness, so uddhacca. It's dusila, which is the lack of virtue or immorality. And it's the asamvara, so the lack of restraint. And so without abandoning a further three things, you can't abandon these three. And so what are they? The Buddha says it's asadhyam, so lack of conviction or confidence. Avadanyuttam, which is the lack of generosity, which is the same as stinginess, same as macharya. And then indolence or idleness, kosajja. It's bordering on laziness, but I think the word indolence is probably a better one to use. And so again, the Buddha says, without abandoning three things, you can't abandon these three. And so the Buddha says the following three are disrespect, anadariyam, duvachasata, which is difficult to instruct, similar to duvacha, and then having bad friends, papamitatam. And so then the last part that the Buddha says is that without having abandoned three things, one is incapable of abandoning these three. And what are they? So you begin with ahirikam, which is the lack of moral shame. So you're quite shameless, no sense of shame towards doing unwholesome things. You have no fear of wrongdoing, quite reckless, so anotapa. And then you're negligent, pamada. So pamada we're also familiar with from Tayodhamma Sutta. It's very negligent, always abiding with unwholesome things. So when you look at what the Buddha is saying, you see that he's given you a pathway. He's given us a pathway. He's given us a pathway in threes, so you can look at each set of three and go back, like what this shows, because if you give each line up, eventually it becomes possible, you're capable of abandoning birth, aging, and death. But while any of these three sets of things exist, it's impossible, the Buddha says, to actually give up greed, hatred, and delusion, impossible to give up birth, aging, and death. So when you look at this Dhamma here, you think, wow, that's how it all fits together. And of course, when we look at it initially, it's like that's a lot of Dhamma there, and it can appear overwhelming. But I think once you start to see we're already doing certain things on the wholesome side, then you realize actually it's not too bad. So let's just broadly look at the sets of three to begin with. So the first lot, this row number 9, lack of moral shame, no fear of wrongdoing, and negligence. This is really like having no integrity. You can sum that up by saying, one has no moral boundaries. You do anything. And so this is where this first group of 3 comes from. If someone was to say, what's the summary of it? It's, well, no moral boundaries, no moral compass, no integrity. And then when you look at row number 9, disrespectful, difficult to instruct, having bad friends, well, this is really likened to you're happy to indulge, you're happy to intoxicate in the world. And so you're enabling unskillful tendencies. And then row number 7, lack of conviction, lack of generosity, indolence. This is like you're growing bad habits. You're happy to grow bad habits. And And then row number 6, restlessness, lack of virtue, lack of restraint. Again, you're generating a lot of unwholesome behavior. Dasa akusala is being generated. You're always looking, you're always restless. You're always going out through the senses. And so with this, you're very much, in the world. And this is a huge challenge. If you keep going down, you can see if you keep going down, it just escalates. And so then the row number 5 is no wish to see the noble ones, no wish to hear the noble Dhamma. You have the fault-finding mind. Well, at this time, it's really you're having a very corrupted mind because you don't want to be challenged about your worldly tendencies, and you don't want to give up the things that you think are giving you happiness, giving you pleasure, and you're denying that it slides, that it's all death-bound, like the experience is death-bound. It rises and then it ceases. And in an ultimate sense, what is birthed eventually ages and then dies. And so you're denying that. And so you don't want to hear anything that reminds you or tells you the truth. And so you always want to pick holes in what is, considered the truth. And so this is very much a corrupted mind. And then when you get to row number 4, forgetfulness, lack of clear comprehension, mental disturbance or confusion, this is really where you're just indulging in wrong ideas and wrong ways of thinking. You either don't know what is the truth and what must be done, or if you're in Dhamma, you don't remember. You don't remember that what you see as Subha is Asubha. What you see as Sukha is really going to end up in Dukkha. What is Atta is really Anatta. And what is Nicca is really Anicca. You forget and you can't see it. And so you're always constantly battling, trying to maintain happiness and then getting very upset when it's not there. And then row number 3 is what we have seen before, Ayonasamanasikara, following the wrong path. So unwise contemplation, then following the wrong path, and then this mental sluggishness. So this is where you keep thinking you can fix it. And so you keep directing back to the wrong things because you thought, well, I could make it happy before, so I keep making it happy the same way I used to. And so you still keep going to the wrong things. And so you develop this wrong path in practice. So for a worldly person, the tendency is still to indulge in the form world, sensual desire, and then all those sorts of things. But in Dhamma, it's also, you develop practice that may be still getting to dull mind states, very dull samadhi, very weak mind, but you don't know that you're actually cultivating the wrong path and practice. And so it is very difficult because if you can see earlier, you're not wishing to see the noble ones, hear the noble Dhamma, you have a fault-finding mind, even if you were to hear the right Dhamma. So by the time you get down to here, you're actually a little bit doomed because you don't want to listen to anybody. And so you keep practicing what you've been practicing. And so the mind doesn't get bright, it doesn't get strong, it doesn't get piercing in terms of piercing through the falsities and getting to the truth. It just stays quite weak. But it feels like maybe you're abiding in a pleasant place. So it could be even a higher concentration, but it's not the concentration that Buddha talks about. And then when you come to row number 2, what you realize here is that because you've been practicing the wrong path and practice, you're blocked by the fetters. And in particular, in this case, what the Buddha is saying is you're blocked from stream entry, that you can't enter the stream because you haven't even been able to remove the first 3 fetters. And if you don't remove the first 3 fetters, you're incapable of removing greed, hatred, and delusion. Now, this is the bit that surprises most people. People often think if I give up my worldly things, if I, give them away and all these sorts of things, but you still have wrong view, particularly associated with the 3 fetters. You doubt the Buddha, Dhamma Sangha, you don't understand the 4 Noble Truths, you don't see that it's actually the Noble Eightfold Path that is the way out of suffering. And you think it's all these other things. It could be, for a worldly person, it could be astrology, it could be wealth, it could be certain eternalist views, it's certain other things, and then what happens is you never uproot greed, hatred, and delusion. And so what happens after that? Well, you're incapable of cutting off anything. And so you're bound to continual rebirth and therefore aging and death and the whole mass of suffering. So that in a nutshell is what that is saying. That gives you a bit of a broad view that this is how we continuously breed greed, hatred, and delusion, via these 30 elements. And you can already see how important it is to understand each element. So what we've just described is very surface level. It gives you an idea, it gives you a picture, but in order to really get to the root of it, you have to actually study each one, and then you have to understand how they link together. Because this, when you realize it, you realize, this is how you progress towards Nibbana. and to escape samsāra. So then we come to the wholesome side. So in this instance, the Buddha's made it somewhat easy for us, because all it really is the abandoning of those unwholesome qualities. So if you want to abandon birth, aging, and death, you have to abandon greed, hatred, and delusion. If you want to abandon greed, hatred, and delusion, you have to abandon the first three fetters at the very least. If you want to abandon the three fetters, you have to have, instead of ayoniso manasikara, this unwise contemplation, you have to have the wise one, the yoniso manasikara. And instead of following the wrong path, one has to actually cultivate the right one. So you abandon the wrong one. You abandon the weak mind, this sluggishness in the mind. And so in order to abandon that, you have to abandon the mutta satchang. You want to be mindful rather than unmindful. You want to have clear comprehension by abandoning the unclear one. And same with this mental disturbance. You need the settled mind, the calm mind, rather than this disturbed one. And then same, in order to abandon that, you need to want to be with the noble ones. That includes Buddha, the Arahants, and anyone who is practicing this noble path. You wish to hear the noble Dhamma, the actual Buddha's words, the insight pathways, these Dhammas, how they fit together. And you abandon the type of mind that is super critical, the one that doesn't want to hear it, that wants to poke holes in it. And then in order to abandon that, you have to abandon restlessness, lack of virtue, all the dusila qualities. You have to abandon the lack of restraint. I mean, we've said time and time again, restraint is very important. The security guard is very important, because when we go out through the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind, we get caught up. We're always in danger because it pulls us out, and then we get duped again, go into the wrong view and search for things that maybe are not helpful to the path. And then to abandon these three things, one needs to abandon the lack of conviction. So you need to cultivate saddha. You need to cultivate, generosity instead of stinginess. You need to cultivate virya or arada viryo, this quality of being energetic towards the path, not this idleness, indolence, tolerating sense pleasures and things like that. And then in order to abandon those things, you need to have more respect for Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, for the Arahants. You need to abandon, the duvita qualities and cultivate the suvita qualities, being easy to instruct, willing to listen, willing to receive feedback. And then abandoning bad friends. Like instead of having bad friends, having kalyanamitta, having sappurusas as friends, those with the good qualities, those that are reminding of the noble path. And then in order to abandon that, well, one has to have a very, very strong sense of moral shame and a fear of wrongdoing. When we get into the nuts and bolts of this, you see this is really knowing that there is bad karma that accrues when we keep doing akutala. And this is the healthy fear that one doesn't want to be reborn into lower realms. One wants to actually get out of the sewer. And of course, vigilance as opposed to negligence, that one really sees the Buddha's teachings and wants to attend to it, wants to actually develop and progress on the path. And so this is the summary of like the wholesome side of it, the part 3 to the sutta, that Buddha is actually saying, having understood samudaya of how we keep coming back into rebirth and then aging and death, the whole mass of suffering, then this is the atangama, this is the passing away. If we cultivate these things, then it's much easier. And we're already doing some of these things, so it's actually quite good to see it in this context. So as we've seen, we recognize that many of these things from other suttas that we've been studying. So we recognize like We've looked at certain things in the Vatupama Sutta, we've looked at it in the Karaniya Metta Sutta, Sekapatipada Sutta, Avijja Sutta, Nagaropama Sutta, Pamada Vihari Sutta, Veluvarya Sutta, many suttas. So, yeah, when you look at it like this, you think, okay, I'm on the right track. And I think that's the encouragement that we go through this life. Sometimes we go through peaks and troughs. We think, oh, it's so much. Or we feel bad, we haven't done enough. And in many ways, it's always encouragement. A sutta like Tayodhamma Sutta is saying, be encouraged with what we have progressed to, but also know there's more. And that should also be an inspiring thing that, yes, it's possible to actually discern and understand, even at this broad level, what the Buddha is meaning by these pathways. And sometimes when you come to Buddha Dhamma, you don't fully understand Loba Dosa Moha path. You don't fully understand Aloba Adosa Moha path. So this gives you a really nice way of putting it into a picture. So now we're going to look more closer at the groupings of 3. And we'll go as deep as possible without, getting too bogged down, because otherwise it would probably take days and weeks to actually explain some of these things. But we'll take a closer look. At another time, of course, you'd want to look at each element individually, and then the groupings of 3, and then the links between the groups, and then the links between the elements, and then the different insight pathways, and then also the smaller insight pathways through. So that would take a lot of time, but we'll keep it broad. So the tables that we were looking at, they can be transformed into these boxes of 3. So this is simply just another representation of that you have these boxes. And we're going to go through each individual box. So that's what we'll do. And as we understand from the Buddha's words, we begin with the box number 9. In order to get to the bottom, having the capacity to abandon lust, hatred, and delusion, and then also birth, aging, and death, one needs to start by abandoning the first 3, which is the lack of moral shame, no fear of wrongdoing, and negligence. So what we hope to get out of this is to become more familiar with the terms. So, be okay with the different Pali words, and be okay with getting a refresh of the things we already know, and then the things that we don't know, learning something new. So the first set is what we talked of as having no moral boundaries, like no moral compass. So the Buddha says one who lacks moral shame and has no fear of wrongdoing is negligent. And so the 3 that fit together are these ahiri, so lack of moral shame, anuttapa, which is the no fear of wrongdoing, and then the pamada, negligence. So with the ahiri, we've covered this before in the Sekapatipada Sutta, where you're okay, you have no shame at engaging in unwholesome bodily conduct. So you're not shameful about killing, taking what's not given, or stealing, sexual misconduct. You have no shame about the verbal side of it, false speech, harsh speech, divisive speech, even empty speech. And you'll also have no shame by cultivating wrong views, covetousness, ill will. And so basically, in a nutshell, ahiri is you have no shame about akusala. And so nothing in you has this internal conscience that says, I shouldn't do that. That's shameful. Instead, it's like, oh, it doesn't matter. I can do what I like. And you can see that that's not a good quality on the Dhamma path. So the example or the simile that the Buddha gives in the Nagaropama Sutta is a moat that is deep and wide is what we want when you have hiri. When you don't have it, then you don't have any sort of security measure, internal conscience to build up good principles and integrity. And then when it comes to anuttapa, this is like you have no fear of consequences. So you're quite reckless. You're not afraid of akusala, that you don't think that there's any repercussions, that you won't suffer as a result of doing bad things, and that there's no bad karma that accrues, and no subsequent rebirth in a bad destination. And so when that is your basis or for operating, then you really have no fear about doing anything. Anything goes, really. That's probably the mentality of what that sounds like. So you don't curb your desires, you don't curb your actions, you just go for it. And so that's why Buddha says when you have these two qualities, it makes progress very difficult on the path, because you never purify in order to walk the Noble Eightfold Path. And so there's this lack of moral compass is quite a difficult and bad thing. And so in the Anattapi Sutta, if you remember, the Buddha says, one who is not ardent, who is not afraid of wrongdoing, is incapable of Nibbana, incapable of achieving security from bondage. And so both of these qualities are really quite troublesome. And so right at the beginning of the path, one actually has to have it. And if you think about Anattapa, if you're not afraid of accruing bad karma, you don't understand the samsāra Sutta, that if you have crooked actions, it results in crooked karma and then crooked rebirth. You end up in a bad destination, lower realms. Then you would actually not be able to realize the path. And so it's actually quite a grave and dire thing. And when it comes to negligence, how that sounds like or looks like is that you're not serious. You're not serious about the things which are important. So you're very careless and frivolous with life. Everything becomes more about seeking sukha, obtaining maximum pleasure, thinking that even these pleasures are permanent, but not knowing that actually all these pleasures are temporary. And so you're negligent towards the path. Maybe you don't even know the truth. But on the Dhamma path, how this manifests is it may seem like, oh, it doesn't matter. Oh, it's only a small thing. Maybe this little bit is okay. And in a worldly sense, it's, oh, it really doesn't matter. I don't really care. We can do whatever we like. And as long as I can, maintain sukha, everything will be right. Everything's about fun, about sport, about laughter, success, wealth. That's the primary focus. So this part of Tayodhamma, when you investigate, there's many layers. So depending on where you are in the spiritual path, you start to peel it away. And so you really start to look at what is really bringing us true happiness. And so when you develop moral boundaries, it's very good. So in this sense, Buddha's saying, be very careful here. So what this leads to is, Buddha says, one who is negligent. So we take it from the previous one, that you end up being negligent. And when one is negligent, one is incapable of abandoning disrespect. This is anadarya, being difficult to instruct, so dovacasatang, and bad friendships, papamitata. And, what basically this is saying is that we have very unskillful tendencies. We're prone to, all these things as a result of negligence. So anadarya is really about disregard for Buddha, for the noble ones, for the arahants. We have a very careless attitude towards them. We dishonor them. We have no reverence towards them. And so what we're doing, instead of revering Buddha and the noble ones and the Buddha Dhamma, is we're revering worldly things, politics, our jobs, all the things that we're making it more, as the priority. And what's said is that we're raising it above, like the triple gem. So when it comes to this aspect, it can be very detrimental, because we raise other things, we're imbued with the deception of the world. There's no truth there. It's very hard for us to come to the truth if we're disrespecting the noble ones. And then when it comes to being difficult to instruct, dovacasata, these are the duvacha qualities. We're not willing to listen to the noble ones. We're not willing to listen to the Dhamma. We won't take feedback and suggestion. We don't want to be corrected. In fact, we're quite stubborn, mentally. We're very mentally rigid, and particularly about what we believe to be true. So if we believe worldly things to be the most important things, that this is what life is about, then we will get angry with anyone who tries to tell us otherwise. That anyone who tries to draw us towards Buddha Dhamma, we tell them off, like, you're silly, and be argumentative and maybe even be offensive. And the same goes in Dhamma, that as you start to refine the path and you search for Sadhamma, true Dhamma, if you think you're in Dhamma, but you are actually following the wrong path, and then someone comes to you and tries to correct you, you actually can be very difficult. And so sometimes we also see that. And Anumana Sutta is the very good sutta for this one, in terms of getting to the heart of it. You know, because when someone reproves you, all these different things come back. You're very defensive, you get angry, all sorts of things. And then you're very rigid, you hold on to your view. And then also you have having bad friends, pāpamitātā. So when it comes to having bad friends, you know, these are the people that don't keep precepts, have poor sila, they're not developing the Noble Eightfold Path, they're more out in the world, they don't have any of the good qualities that the Buddha talks about, so no conviction, no moral shame, no fear of wrongdoing. You know, no, they're not bahusata, they have no learning. And also the Buddha says about people who are considered have bad qualities, they're stingy, they're ungrateful, they give the wrong advice, they encourage you in the wrong things. And so essentially you're with people who are bad role models, which makes sense. So you disrespect the true noble ones, and yet your role models are probably the people that are indulging in the world through social media, through you know, celebrities, politics, and you know, these worldly things, and encouraging you to keep, you know, doing bad things. So on the one end of the spectrum, it's encouraging you to drink, to party, to gamble, to indulge in even worse things, from, you know, sex, drugs, violence, and more. And in another sense, when you're in Dhamma, it could be they just encourage you, you know, to be lax at times. And sometimes this is actually quite bad, because when you really see the true Dhamma, like in an ultimate sense, you don't want to delay. The sense of urgency is there. So when you're with the wrong people, even in Dhamma, they kind of also say, oh, you know, dropping a bit of, you know, empty speech, it's okay. It's okay to be divisive. Let's talk some politics, you know, not knowing that actually it actually cultivates the rest of this Tayodhamma, as we shall see. So this is a way of looking at it to see the context. Sometimes people say, oh, you're too serious about it. But if you're not serious, then you actually become quite negligent, and it creeps in. And so this is more of an encouragement not to allow these qualities to keep creeping in, not to grow them at the very least, but at least reduce them in some way. So we're trainees, so we can't get to perfection yet, but we still need to make sure we're doing the right thing on the path. So when you end up with that, when you have bad friends, the Buddha says one who has bad friends is incapable of abandoning lack of conviction, stinginess, and indolence. So we understand, you know, saddha, you know, these are the bad habits where we become very stubborn about our views, and we lack almost like the conviction and confidence in Buddha Dhamma Sangha, and therefore we're not practicing really. Indolence sets in. So saddha is actually really, really important. Many people, because they misinterpret saddha, they think it's blind faith. But the more you practice Dhamma, you realize saddha is very much about trust, confidence, removing of doubt about the Buddha's enlightenment, all the qualities of the Buddha, and then also the path, the Dhamma and the path and the noble ones. So when you actually develop saddha, it can be such a pillar. Like if you remember from the Sekapatipada Sutta and the Nāgaropama Sutta, the simile of the fortress, it's the foundation pillar in the fortress. And it's actually something that you remove any doubts about what Buddha is talking about. And as we know, saddha is something that becomes an indriya. You know, one of the spiritual faculties is a spiritual power. It's considered the greatest wealth in terms of, you know, the 7 riches. And so when you think about asaddha, there's a sutta that it said that asaddha, the greatest asaddha is labha, you know, gain. So when you think about labha, sakara, siloka, gain in the world, you know, wanting honor, wanting popularity or fame, these are the things that are the opposite of saddha. So when you have worldly tendencies, you're always seeking labha, you're always seeking this gain, you're seeking popularity, you're seeking, respect from the world. But Buddha's thing is actually not about that. And when you develop more of a rooted saddha, which is out of practicing the Buddha's instructions, seeing the good results, then you realize actually what the Buddha says is so true. One needs to actually develop this more. Now, on the Dhamma path, what we find is we think that we have good saddha even on the Dhamma path. So it's easy to see for people who are worldly that are coming to Dhamma that it is underdeveloped. But for us, it's always good to recognize that we are still underdeveloped on saddha, because we're meant to develop this unshakable conviction towards the Buddha Dhamma Sangha, avecca pasada. And, Tayodhamma Sutta speaks about this, that when you practice the purification of the mental stains, you reach this avecca pasada. And what this is really that you don't delay, you go straight for the goal, because you really take Buddha's words, it really penetrated, you realize something so true. But what happens is, the reason why it's important to see that we don't have fully developed faith is because as trainees, we still delay. We still get caught up in worldly things, due to our responsibilities as well as other things. And we don't always arouse energy. We're actually a little bit slack at times. And so we haven't fully developed this faith, because if we did, then we would attend to it. We wouldn't delay so much, and we wouldn't get diverted and distracted from the final goal. So the goal, we're on a train heading for Nibbana, but we take stops. There might be 10 stops along the way. And so it's good to recognize it, as one of these qualities of a saddha, how we can look at it. Then when it comes to lack of generosity, this is stinginess, this is macharya. So we know there are many different forms of macharya, the 5 different types. So we lack charity, we're uncharitable, we lack openness. And we know it's a defilement, we know it blocks metta. And in particular to this particular aspect of Tayodhamma, it's really pretty much a lot to do with Dhammamacharya. We won't budge from our wrong view. Whatever we think is the truth, we won't budge from it. And so for that reason, we are also willing to indulge in indolence and idleness. And we, in many ways, we're not open to hearing the truth. And that comes from those other things we've already gone through, that we're not willing to budge from it. And so we keep holding on to these wrong views. We're unable to chaga. So there's no chaga adhikana. And so we can get quite angry about certain things. So that's one of the things to know about that. And in terms of indolence, then this is really idleness. It's inclined towards laziness, but it's actually also the precursor to laziness. So there's a sense of inertia, like not moving, not wanting to move the body, not wanting to move the mind in a wholesome way. It's quite okay being slothful, being lazy in one sense. But it's usually when we're too tired and we lack energy, we want to just lie down and just indulge in sensual pleasures, actually, when we're lying down or sitting on the couch. So the good sutta for this is the Kusita Rambhavata Sutta, Anguttara Nikaya Chapter 8, Discourse number 80. So there are about 8 grounds that sutta talks about. It's like when you have some work to do, then, you don't feel like, you think, I'm too tired, so why don't I go lie down because I've got some work coming up? Or you've done some work and the same thing comes to your mind, I need to go lie down, I'm tired. Or you have to make a trip, and so in preparation for the trip, you think, I'm too tired, I'm going to lie down. Or you've made the trip, and again, it's the same thing, too tired, I want to go lie down. And then the other one is around, in the case of this sutta, it talks about monks and nuns, about going for alms and receiving insufficient food, and receiving alms and receiving sufficient food. But in our case, it could be that, we've gone and done what we need to do and we've had sufficient or insufficient food. And so we just want to go and sit in front of the telly. And the last two is we've had a little bit of an illness. And so again, the same thought comes, I'm too tired, I'll go and sit down or lie down. Then you've just recovered from illness. So you give yourself a bit of an out. I've just recovered, so I'll just go and sit down and relax. The main thing about this is that we kind of don't pay attention to the fact that we still need to walk the path. We still need to tend, arouse energy towards the path. We give ourselves excuses. So indolence is really that we're prepared to delay. We're prepared to take breaks. We're prepared not to arouse energy. And so when we do that, the bad habits tend to arise and multiply. We're happy to indulge while we're lying down or sitting down in sense pleasures. And so when we start to do that more, what happens is we block any intention towards the path. We start tolerating things that are not really helpful to the path. And, we keep eating, keep listening to music, keep watching TV. And so those things overtake us. And that's why it's important not to allow those to enter. And what the Buddha also says, and what you can see from particularly Kosajja, that it blocks higher concentration because you're overindulging, tolerating unwholesome things. It leads to actually wrong actions by body, speech, and mind. And so it blocks things like the psychic abilities, it blocks higher concentration, it blocks harder. So if one wants to actually develop those different kinds of faculties and abilities, then you have to actually give up Kosajja. So then when we come to when we're indolent, when we have this Kosajja, Buddha says one who is indolent is incapable of abandoning restlessness. So then you can't abandon lack of restraint and lack of virtue. So with this, what happens is because of indolence, this idleness, you start generating more unwholesome behavior. So this is where the dusila comes in and where the restlessness comes in, where the lack of restraint comes in. Because when you are indolent, it goes hand in hand with tolerating sensual pleasures. So the mind is always restless towards sensual pleasures. The mind and all the sense faculties are not restrained. You go looking for sense pleasures. You go listening for sense pleasures. You go wanting the physical sensation of sense pleasures. You're looking for taste through the tongue. And even through the mind, you want to go and absorb things into your mind that are not helpful to the path, and so on and so forth. And so from there, what happens is you have this lack of virtue. You're quite prepared to compromise sila in order to indulge. And so this is very dangerous, that the mind is always active, it's always seeking, it's agitated. So this is the uddhacca. So we get agitated in a physical sense. We want to go and seek out. And so the mind is constantly moving. I need to go to the shop. I need to go here and there. Oh, I need to travel. I need to, this and that. And even if you watch someone who has a restless mind, the legs start shaking because the mind is shaking. And so it's never settled or composed. Like when you think about the Buddha's teaching, the opposite of uddhacca is that you can settle the mind. It understands the nature of sense pleasures, unwholesome things. It can easily become settled. But in the case of when we're indolent, we actually allow these things to get created. And so we can't abandon restlessness. And it can be usually combined with kukucca. We know as a hindrance, uddhacca goes with kukucca. So when you're on the central path, it's very obvious. You're restless all the time. There's no Dhamma there. There's a lot of wanting, longing, and you basically work your way through the hindrances. So you work your way through ill will, sloth and torpor, restlessness and worry and doubt. So this is where we make excuses for our lifestyles. Like even in Dhamma, we make excuses. We have this kind of responsibility. We need this. We want to make our families happy. And so we give them sensual pleasures. We all kind of stay restless. But rather than trying to fix it, just by understanding this, it's the first thing. It's better to understand where this is coming from. And then later on, it can correct itself. So then when it comes to lack of restraint, well, you understand, you keep going to look, going to see, going to hear, smell, taste, touch. And it's a real obstacle on the Noble Eightfold Path. This is where we don't have the security guard in place. We're very pamada, it comes from the negligence originally. And what you notice with the asangvara is that you always end up in abhijja domanassa. You always end up with this coveting mind, and you end up quite sad. You're sad either because you wanted something and you have to go and get it. So, it's the longing for it, and then you get it, but then it ends, or you can't get it and you're sad as a result of that. So there are two types of things. But when you're unrestrained, it's the mind can become very, very unhappy, very, very unhappy. And the Avijja Sutta, as we know, it says, if you don't guard the sense doors, then this leads to bad conduct. You end up fighting over things, and you don't understand that no matter what object you take. So you remember Pamada Vihari Sutta, no matter what object you take, the contact, the feeling, it all ends up in dukkha. So you have vipranama dukkha, so painfulness in change. You have dukkha dukkhata, painfulness in pain. And you have sankhara dukkha, painfulness in construction. So there's a lot of deep Dhamma even in that. And then when it comes to the lack of virtue, then you're quite prepared to cultivate dusila, unwholesome, unskillful things through body, speech, and mind in order to satisfy one's longings. And so these three go together. And so where you get to is when you are dusila, when you're not virtuous, you have this immorality, you're incapable of abandoning wish to see noble ones and no wish to hear the noble Dhamma. So you can't abandon, not wishing for any of those two things, and you have a fault-finding mind. So this is essentially, you have a corrupt mind. You're avoiding the goodness and the truth, and you always keeping company with the unwholesome, the unskillful, the bad. And so the mind is becoming always associated with unwholesome mind states. And what you're doing when you don't wish to see noble ones and you don't wish to hear the noble Dhamma, you're actually guarding from the truth. And instead, you want to keep your toys. You want to stay with the unwholesome. And it sounds very horrible to say, but essentially you're guarding unwholesome mind states, and your tendency is towards unwholesome mind states. And so the fault-finding mind comes from that you're always looking at things in a very negative way, very unwholesome way. When you don't want to see the noble ones, it's because of impurity. When you're dusila, what you don't want is for a noble one to blame you, to point out your bad tendencies, to be admonished, to be blamed for it, to be even punished for it, or to even just simply be seen. And so when you have bad habits like drinking alcohol, taking drugs, all these things, you don't want to go and see noble ones because someone will tell you, don't do that. And you don't want to be revealed that way. And even if you are, you would get angry if a noble one told you that, gave you good advice, but you take it as, oh, you're harming me. And then even those that go to see the noble ones, this is where the fault-finding mind can come in. You would go there, but with a super critical mind. So you listen to the Dhamma, but you're saying, oh, that's wrong. That's wrong. No, I don't believe that. And, you go there with that kind of mind. One of the really important things in the Dhamma path is that not to block the noble ones. Because if one blocks the noble ones, you can't connect with them, then they don't help you on this path. So even when it comes to noble beings, if you want the help from Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, from the Arahats, then deep down, the reason why we can't connect is because we feel shameful. It goes all the way back to Hiri. And when you start to see that, you realize the more you start to purify in order to walk the path, the more you can get the help from the Arahats. You get the help to see the ñāṇapathās, to actually unlock some of the areas where we're just so mentally rigid that we don't wish to see, but we do need the help with. So the good way of looking at this, not wishing to see noble ones, is like the naughty child. When you're naughty, you don't want to see your parent because you don't want your parent to tell you off. Or at school, you don't want the teacher to come and tell you off. And so the naughty child is like, okay, don't want to see you. And then when you don't wish to hear the noble ones, it's a similar thing. You don't want to be corrected. You don't want to hear the truth. You don't want to hear the Buddha saying that if you indulge in unwholesome things, you'll end up in a bad destination. And who wants to hear that? But if it's the truth, then it's the bitter pill that you take in order to then get the good medicine. So what we're happy with when we guard from the noble Dhamma is that we're guarding the wrong Dhammas. So we're guarding worldly matters, science, astrology, politics, entertainment, all this stuff about eternalism, annihilism, fake Buddha quotes, all the different things that are not Buddha Dhamma, not Sad Dhamma, not the true Dhamma. And so we raise that above Buddha. And so what happens is we're still very lost in the world because we're not seeing our predicament. And then with the fault-finding mind, we're always looking for holes. There's a lot of makka palasa, a lot of derogation, a lot of divisiveness in the mind. And so you end up having harsh speech, you end up having divisive speech, you're just super critical. And so, it's very hard to penetrate the teaching. So even in Dhamma, if you go to a Dhamma talk, but you go there looking for faults in the person that's speaking, in the talk itself, even to oneself, and then you have Ayona-samana-sikara as well, and you have a disturbed mind. This is from the Pathama Samatha Niyama Sutta. Then you don't penetrate the Dhamma. So it's a real block to the truth. So poor sila, like immorality, triggers this kind of mind. You look at everything through a very critical, unhelpful, unwholesome mind. And so then when we have the fault-finding mind, what the Buddha says is that you're unable or incapable of abandoning forgetfulness, lack of clear comprehension, and mental disturbance. So what this really means is that we indulge in the wrong way of thinking. We don't remember the truth. We don't remember the right view. And so we're basically cultivating a very, very problematic mind, an upset mind. Because if it comes from a fault-finding mind, then this mental disturbance is really confusion. It's really a mind that is upset, a little bit deranged, because deranged is another word that's used for vikepa. And in terms of forgetfulness, there's a lack of sati. So the important thing about the lack of sati and the lack of clear comprehension, so this mutta satchang, so lack of sati, forgetfulness, lack of clear comprehension, asampajanya, is really that we're not forgetting and we're not having the clarity about everything. It's about the lack of mindfulness and the lack of clear comprehension about birth, old age, sickness, and death. That this is the cause of dukkha, that there is these four noble truths, that there is kusala, akusala. And so you get to know that what you need to remember is actually kayanupassana, vedanupassana, chittanupassana, and Dhammānupassana. All these things that are correcting one's view, that's what you need to remember. That's what you need to penetrate, to have clarity about. So otherwise, if you're not having those things, that if you keep contacting the mind towards subha, sukha, anicca, so again, beauty, happiness, worth taking as me and mine, and lasting. If you don't abandon that, you forget that, and you don't have a clarity about it, then you're wandering around lost. You keep going towards things that are sliding. And so the mental disturbance comes in because you think, I'm meant to have this internal happiness. But then something happens in the world that disturbs you. And so it keeps breaking the settled mind, the belief that you can keep your mind happy. So in a worldly sense, something happens in the world like a pandemic, like you lose your job, like your child gets sick, like your parent passes away. All these different external things in a worldly sense comes to break that. And so the mind gets into a very confused state because it thought, out of all the things that we've gone through, everything should have been all right. It should have been fine. But this comes and tells you, but it's not. And then in the Dhamma sense, it's when you meditate and you keep striving for higher concentration states, but something comes to keep making you fall from them. And so you get mentally upset. You can get confused, like, why isn't the mind luminous? Why am I not able to stay in this place that gives me this better sukha? Because when you're in Dhamma, usually what happens is you let go of sensual, like the form kind of sukha, and you go towards the formless kind of sukha, And so it's a higher concentration. But even when that breaks, it's not lasting. You get this cetaso vikepa, and you go, what's that about? And so Buddha's teaching is actually also always to say, even these arupa jhanas, they're also constructed. You know, form jhanas are constructed, formless jhanas are constructed. So when you start to look at it like this, you start to comprehend, actually, Buddha knows a lot of things, and one needs to attend to the ñāṇapathās, the way the Buddha is asking us to meditate, so we don't fall into these different areas. And so when it comes to being mentally disturbed, Buddha says one is incapable of abandoning unwise attention or unwise contemplation. You follow the wrong path and you get mentally sluggish. You get this weak mind. So this is really, because of all those things before, you end up continually directing the mind to the wrong path and practice. You know, so this is one in the worldly sense. And the second one is in the wrong spiritual path when it comes to when you are in Dhamma, that you still haven't gotten onto the right path, because ayoniso manasikara and listening to the wrong Dhammas leads you to wrong view. And so wrong view means wrong path, you know, so wrong intention, wrong speech, wrong action, wrong livelihood, wrong effort, wrong mindfulness, and wrong concentration. And then ultimately, wrong knowledge, wrong liberation. So what happens when you have this ayoniso manasikara, this unwise contemplation, which is what we looked at a great deal in the last poya, so we won't go any more deeply, is that you can spend a long time practicing the wrong practice as a result of ayoniso manasikara. That if you're still imbued with akusala, you're still okay with breeding defilements, you don't apply Buddha's medicine, you still fall for subha, sukha, atta, nicca, instead of the wise one, which is asubha, dukkha, anatta, nicca, that you see it's unlasting, it's not beauty, there's foulness, that it does lead to dukkha, and that it's not worth taking as me and mine, and that one must cultivate kusala to develop the path and develop the other parts of the path. Then if you don't do all that, and you keep in the unwise path, then you can spend a very, very long time in what Buddha calls this weak mind state, mental sluggishness. So with this mental sluggishness, it's linked to a lethargic body. It's the part before tīna mitta. So the mind has shrunk and it becomes very weak. There's sickness in the mind because you take on the wrong Dhammas. And so it's very clear the combination of these three is that in a worldly sense, you're weak due to the bad habits. So you have alcohol, drugs, all these sort of things, sensual desire. So it's very obvious. Like if you're still very worldly, then the mind is very weak because you're tolerating, indulging all the unwholesome things. You're not developing the mind. You're not going in any direction, quite lost. But on the spiritual path, you keep developing the wrong mind state. It's this very weak, dull, abiding mind state. And you make no distinction between kusala and akusala. So one wonders, why is there no luminosity in the mind? Why is there no insight? Like no true insight. Why is everybody else getting this insight? Yet this mind and the things that I'm cultivating are still dull. I feel like I'm resting somewhere. So this is something to investigate. This is still surface level, but it gives you an idea. So then when it comes to when we're mentally sluggish or have this weakened mind, what the Buddha says is you can't penetrate the filters. So, you can't abandon the Sakkaya Ditthi, personal existence view, or also known as self view, identity view. You can't penetrate doubt, the Vicikicca, and you can't abandon the misapprehension of virtue and observances, so the Silabbata Paramasa. This is essentially you're blocked from stream entry. You're unable to enter the stream. So this is what we looked at in one of our previous Poya sessions. And there's a number of Q&As on YouTube that are associated with this. There's one called What is Abandoned by a Stream Enterer? That's very useful at looking at this. There's also one about doubt, that it's the doubt about Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, about the the Four Noble Truths. That is the block. This is the doubt. It's not the hindrance of doubt. It's the fetter of doubt. And there's also a Q&A about perfect virtue that's also useful at looking at Sila Paramasa, that some people, they believe if you keep absolutely pristine virtue, that's what liberates you. But Buddha doesn't say that. Buddha says it's the Noble Eightfold Path that is the way out of suffering. And in that you do cultivate sila, but it's not the be-all and end-all to get you out of samsāra. So that's a distinction. Other people also believe that if you, all sorts of things, if you practice a certain way, you eat certain things, if you follow certain astrology, all kinds of things, those kinds of observances, those kinds of virtue will liberate you, result in Nibbana, but it's not true. Buddha says it's the Noble Eightfold Path is the way out. So when you look at these things, like the first one, Sakkaya Ditthi, it's really about when we don't understand this body, when fundamentally, like what we went through in the last Poya session was when we don't understand these 5 aggregates subject to clinging, that because we grasp onto them, insist on them, that we don't see that it's anicca, that's not lasting, that there is dukkha that we experience, it's painful, and that it's subject to change. There's this aging process, this sickness process, and then we actually pass away. So we're perishable. And so Sakkaya Ditthi doesn't arise when we understand that. But Sakkaya Ditthi arises because we don't understand. And so we keep grasping to the 5 aggregates as me and mine. We take, this is mine. And so Buddha says that there are 20 different wrong views that are assigned to this Sakkaya Ditthi. 15 are eternalistic and 5 are nihilistic. So it's very important. A lot of the meditations that we've looked at around this that can uproot it, including the Samadhi Bhavana Sutta. And then when you come to doubt, what we know is this is very much about doubt about the Buddha, the way he was enlightened, all the qualities, the Dhamma, that the Dhamma can be actually understood right now. We can actually see it for ourselves. The Sangha, that there are the 4 pairs, the 8 kinds of noble beings that have realized stream entry, once return, non-return, and arahant. And that we understand that there is dukkha, jatapi dukkha, jarampi dukkha, vyadipi dukkha, maranampi dukkha, all the different dukkhas, all the way to not getting what we want. And that there is this cause of dukkha that comes from tanha. We're still grasping. And then we understand that we need to actually remove ourselves from this. We need to realize the way out, realize and develop the way out, develop the path of the way out. And so you make that distinction. Once you get that correct, then you can uproot that fetter. And then, of course, what we just said about having the wrong ideas about what it takes to be liberated. So then when you have doubt, you can't enter the stream. Therefore, you can't uproot greed, hatred, and delusion. So this is the one that people don't cognize. You really need to enter the stream in order to start uprooting greed, hatred, and delusion. And that's why Buddha shared it so widely with lay people. And of course, with the monks and nuns and Brahmins and all the different people that he came across and all the people that he saw that were ready. That fundamentally one needs to correct the view. And when you correct it, then you remove any doubt. And so when this happens, you start to abandon greed, hatred, and delusion. What you notice is once you're Sotapanna, when you reach, you keep developing the path and you get to Sakadagami, what is removed at that point is further greed, hatred, and delusion, because this is the path that you're going through. Like this Tayodhamma is that you keep refining, keep developing, keep abandoning. And so you purify, you develop more insight, and then what happens is you can start to abandon greed, hatred, and delusion. Otherwise, the Buddha says that you're not capable. Now, what we know about lust, hatred, and delusion is very much around the nutriments. So if you remember from Kapalinkara Hara, the physical nutriment, this is how we end up burning with lust. So we remember this from the Satara Hara, going the 4 bad ways. We end up burning with lust if we start with the physical nutriment, we take it as subha rather than asubha, you cling to sensual desires, you bond with sensual desires, there's the body tie of covetousness, then you keep triggering the taint of sensual desire, then you have the flood of sensual desires, and then where do you end up? Raga salang, so burning with lust. And then when it comes to hatred, same thing, pasa ahara, contact as nutriment. You take sukha rather than dukkha. Then you end up with silabbata upadana. So you have this clinging to virtues and the wrong kinds of observances. Then you have the bond of existence, bhava yoga, vyapada kaiganta. So you have this ill will when it slides. You can't hold on to the sukha. It didn't fulfill your expectations. So it triggers, again, the bhavasava, the taint of existence, bhava orga, the flood of existence. And then you end up with dosasala, burning with hate, right? So that's where hatred comes. And then with delusion, of course, is the combo of manosanchetana hara and vijnana hara. But if we just go down the vijnana hara, consciousness as nutriment, we take nicca, we take permanency instead of anicca. Impermanency, unlasting. And so you get this attavadu upadana. We cling to this sense of self that we think is permanent, to other constructions that we think of as permanent. So we get avidya yoga, bond of ignorance. Then when that happens, we have this idam satya binivesa kayaganta, body type of insistence that this is the truth. That because we take it as permanent, we adamantly hold on to this view. And how we do that is our mind keeps tricking us. We keep going and reconstructing permanency, even though it keeps falling apart, it keeps disintegrating. And then when it comes to this, it triggers the taint of ignorance, avidya asava. Then we get flooded with the ignorance, so avidya orga. And then we come to this mohasala, so burning with delusion. And so that's actually, how we get to increasing that. If we haven't removed the fetters, we have these wrong views, we're still imbued with the vipalasas. We cling, we get bonded, keep activating the body ties. There are the taints, the floods, and then, we're burning. Excuse me. So when that happens, you can't abandon lust, hatred, and delusion, or greed, hatred, and delusion, then we're incapable of, abandoning birth, aging, and death. So this is how we keep ourselves bound to samsāra. So this is very deep Dhamma. This is only a very broad view of it, but you can already see if you went through each and every little part, one could actually find more insight. Then if you go through the groups of 3, you could definitely see more. So this is the first part. So I'm just going to take a mini break, a 5-minute comfort break, and then we'll come back and I'll briefly go through the other side of it, and then quickly go through the insight pathways, and then we'll open up for Q&A. So Teruvan Saranai, we'll be back in 5 minutes. Teruan Saranai. Okay, so where we get to is we've looked at the unwholesome side and we'll quickly run through the wholesome side. And I don't think this one needs to be as long because we've actually been through the samudaya side. It gives us an understanding anyway. But I'll briefly go through again. So you see these groups of three that help us to actually abandon ultimately birth, aging, and death. And so you see the things that one needs to abandon is exactly the same as what we went through in the unwholesome side. So when we have moral boundaries, what the Buddha is saying is that one who has moral shame and fear of wrongdoing is vigilant. So we have this appamada ability because we do have an internal conscience that is kicking in, you know, this integrity that feels shame from doing wrong and also fears doing wrong because it understands karma and rebirth. I mean, essentially, that is what this group of three is about, that you actually cultivate the path from a place of wisdom because you know actually there are consequences and it's actually shameful in order to keep doing those wrong things that actually ultimately lead to keep coming back and also the danger of lower realms. And then when it comes to being vigilant, if we're vigilant, then you're capable of abandoning disrespect, being difficult to instruct, and bad friendships. So this is really, you start leaning towards wanting to cultivate a path and people around you that help and support you on the path, that help you to progress and have the good qualities. So you have good role models in this sense when you have, you know, good friends, when you abandon the bad ones and you cultivate the good ones, and you develop much more of this respect towards Buddha and the noble arahants because you want their encouragement and support through the suttas and through the practice. And so instead of anadarya, it becomes adarya. And you see the value, you know, of the Buddha's teaching. And it's said that when one has adarya, it's really more about having this way of metta karuna. I mean, one of the reasons why we connect is because of metta karuna. And so when you have respect, it's more from metta karuna than anything else. And so it's very good to have that kind of practice that you're continually developing metta, developing karuna. Then when it becomes, you know, you're more suvacha instead of duvacha, that you're willing to take feedback from kalyana mitta, that you're willing to receive that feedback in order to progress. Because that's what the Buddha has said, that if one wants to progress, wants to have distinction in one's practice, then you need friends to tell you and remind you and encourage you on the path. And so you're willing to take that feedback. Then when we have good friends, we're capable of abandoning lack of conviction, stinginess, and indolence. So here it's really towards arousing energy, that we're no longer slacking off and remaining idle. We're no longer keeping so much company, even with sense pleasures. It's starting to reduce. You start to see they're only temporary, and you start to develop the path. So you develop sukha viharana in meditation, knowing it's still constructed, but Buddha recommends it rather than sense pleasures. There's more danger in sense pleasures. And when you cultivate this as well, Buddha talks about you abandon the stinginess. And this is stinginess even around views, that you start not just being able to give in terms of the physical giving process. One becomes a giver more than a taker. But in terms of one's views, you're less rigid. Particularly, you're not so concerned about worldly things. Yes, they're happening and you attend to them, but they're not a priority. You start to have more openness towards the Buddha's word and what needs to be done, because that's what's helpful to the path. And then when it comes to saddha, then you really continue to develop it towards Buddha Dhamma Sangha. You know it's a very important pillar. You know that you need it in order to stop delaying the path, to keep developing the conviction in order to see more sense of urgency. So you don't keep making stops on the train that is going towards Nibbana. You start to see, actually, something's still not right here. I need to look at that. And so when we are energetic, so when we have this quality of arousing energy towards the path, then it really becomes abandoning some of these poor qualities, that we no longer want to cultivate bad behavior because we no longer have bad habits. We actually start to cultivate better sila. And so here, this is the energy towards abandoning restlessness. You go more towards a settled mind rather than a restless one. One also is more assured about dasa kusala and is more restrained around dasa akusala. So you have more of the good conduct through body, speech, and mind. You're continually trying to improve it, so you have more purity. And then in terms of restraint, you actively put your security guard in place. So when you go out, you ensure the security guard is there. You still go about your business. That if you need to go and get things, you get them. But the security guard is still up so that you don't wander through the eye, ears, nose, tongue, body, because you see the danger of it. And so one of the things that's really good for that is when it comes to even dusila, it's good to even remember that we often think our dusila qualities can be hidden. It's always good to reflect, well, what would the noble ones say if they were to observe? And then it's very helpful towards the path. That arouses energy, arouses sort of like this creating good behavior. And so when we go to when we are virtuous, then the Buddha is saying, you're capable of abandoning no wish to see noble ones, no wish to hear the noble Dhamma, and fault-finding mind. So instead, you gravitate towards the noble ones. You gravitate towards the Buddha's words. You gravitate to the words of the Arahants. You gravitate towards the bhavana of it. And you want to hear all the things that are going to help you on the path. You see Dhamma Vinaya as your teacher. And so out of better virtue, so when you have more morality because you've purified, like you've purified through doing certain meditations, you actually also want to connect, with Aryas. And so it's possible because there's no blame, there's no reproach. You know that you've actually quite purified. And so you're happy to see the noble ones. And again, with virtue, you're open to the noble Dhamma. You don't feel threatened by hearing the Dhamma because you want to develop and progress. You're happy to abandon the wrong ways. And so you're eager to listen. Often it's the opposite. When you have something to hide, when you're still holding on to unwholesome things, you don't want to be reminded. You don't want to be shown. And then when it comes to fault-finding mind, well, when you walk the Noble Eightfold Path and you're with the Buddha, you're with the people that have a lot of reverence to the Buddha and the Dhamma and the Sangha, then you know that you don't listen, with a fault-finding mind. You actually abandon that. You actually try your best to penetrate, to realize the truth, to link things up, to see how it fits with one's practice. And you feel mudita as well towards others who are on the path, that you're happy for them, you're happy to be with them. And then when it comes to when we don't have the fault-finding mind, then you're capable of abandoning forgetfulness, lack of clear comprehension, and mental disturbance. So with this, you have more sati. You have more sati towards the truth. So, you know about birth, aging, sickness, and death as dukkha, the cause of the dukkha, the cessation of dukkha. You're working to realize the cessation of dukkha, and you know that the Noble Eightfold Path is the way out. And so you constantly remind yourself not to fall for the vipalasas, for the corruptions of the mind. And so you're not lost in the world. You're actually cultivating kusala in order to actually have clarity. You don't fall for the deception. Instead, you see it. And then you cultivate more of this settled mind. That's why we bhavana, because we're actually removing the confusion. We see the construction in this world. We're no longer surprised or shocked, by the sliding nature of constructed phenomena. We understand the bigger predicament that everything is death-bound. And so we're not shocked. We're more prepared And so the mind can remain quite calm, and it wants to follow the Buddha's instructions. And so when we're not mentally disturbed, when instead we're mentally undisturbed, that means we have a very settled mind, then it's possible for us to keep developing the right direction for the mind. So you give up unwise contemplation, you give up following the wrong path, and you give up mental sluggishness. So you're no longer taking refuge in worldly things, all the things that we always bring up, politics, astrology, war, science, different pockets of knowledge to either delay us or take us down the wrong path, or different practices that take us down the wrong path, and the wrong view in particular. And so really, when you have abandoned ayoniso manasikara, you have yoniso manasikara. So you're always remembering, asubha instead of subha, dukkha instead of sukha, anatta instead of atta, anicca instead of nicca, and also kusala. You're actively removing defilements and hindrances. You're not tolerating to abide with defilements and hindrances because it's quite dangerous. It's very difficult to concentrate the mind, and so you can't develop insight from that. And so you keep steering it back to right view, keep reactivating the right view. So in that way, you abandon the wrong path because you start with right view. And then as a result of that, what you cultivate is the mental brightness. No longer dull, you get illuminated. There's wisdom and insight that can develop from that. And so instead of developing hindrances and defilements, what you develop instead is the bojjhangas. So the enlightenment factors, the iddhipadas, the basis of spiritual power, the indriyas, the balas, so the spiritual faculties, the powers, and so on. So then when you abandon that, what happens is when you give up the weak, when you give up the mental sluggishness, so instead of the weak mind, you have a strong mind, then you're capable of abandoning the three fetters. So we've been through this before, that it's the weak mind that blocks because you're walking the wrong path, you're coming from the wrong view. So there's no way that you would see this body correctly, the virtue correctly, and you would still, because you're not being led by Buddha and the Buddha's teachings, then you would have all these doubts. And so it's impossible actually to uproot the three fetters unless you've started abandoning all these other things. And so when you have done so on this wholesome side, then you can do so. So it's with the strong mind, the bright mind, the one that has wisdom, that you can actually uproot and remove the fetters. And so when you don't have doubt about Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, the Four Noble Truths, kusala, then you've entered the stream, and so you are capable of abandoning lust or greed, hatred and delusion. And so you actually start to understand how one has gone the bad way before, and so you're cautious regarding form in the case of lust, that you don't want to misapprehend the physical nutriment. In terms of hatred, you don't want to misapprehend contact and feelings. You understand dukkha correctly. And in terms of delusion, then you actually understand the unlasting nature, and that's not worth taking as me and mine. And you understand things are all subject to decay, it's all painful, and it's all constructed. And so when it comes to consciousness as nutriment, you actually attend to that quite carefully. So then when that happens, when you've actually seen that you've given up these wrong views and you've given up lust, hatred, and delusion, then you get to being able, you have the capacity, possibility of giving up birth, aging, and death. And so at that point, it's possible to realize Nibbana. So one is capable of realizing Nibbana. So that is essentially, the broad overview of the Buddha's teaching on the Tayodhamma Sutta. And the only other thing that we'll go through is just looking at insight pathways. And we've already covered to a certain extent, but we haven't looked at like the lobha, dosa, moha, and alobha, dosa, moha. So I just want to quickly give you an idea. But firstly, I want to just remind, some of you may have seen this on YouTube already. This was used in answer about unlocking the Buddha's code, that ñāṇapathā is actually about adhisila, adhichitta, adhipanya. And when you train in these higher trainings, then this is how you unlock the Buddha's code. This is how you develop the better virtue, which then allows you to develop the mind, so higher concentrations, and then allows you to develop the wisdom. So under the higher virtue, you become virtuous. All the things associated with sila sampanno, one of the training qualities. And this activates the Noble Eightfold Path in terms of the right effort, the right mindfulness, and the right concentration. And then when it comes to the mind, because you understand that you want to be secluded from sense pleasures, that you want to be secluded from akusala, the unwholesome states, it's possible to realize the jhanas, so the mental absorptions. And so what this activates is right speech, right action, right livelihood, because you refrain from all the things which are unwholesome. And then as a result of that, you develop a higher wisdom. So, you have wisdom about the samudaya, the atangama, the arising and the passing away. You start to penetrate that through many, many teachings of the Buddha. You understand the Four Noble Truths, and you go through the different insight stages of the Four Noble Truths. And then you understand, ultimately, at the end, when one realizes Nibbana, the whole of it. So you have fully penetrated, and then you uproot the taints, and so you realize Nibbana. And so really what's activated is right view, right intention. So when we look at ñāṇapathas, whether it's in the Tayodhamma Sutta, the Karaniya-metta Sutta, any of the suttas that we're looking at, this is what we're essentially doing. So when we look at the Tayodhamma Sutta, it's the same. We're also doing this. We're activating the Noble Eightfold Path, and we're training in this adhisila, the higher virtue. We're training in the higher mind. So when you start to contemplate these Dhammas, mind will start to concentrate, particularly if you're purifying and you're abandoning the unwholesome ones. And when you get the insight into it, then you develop this higher wisdom. And so it's a gradual process. We don't realize Nibbana straight away. It takes us time. And it takes us time to understand the Buddha's words in a theoretical sense, and then to practice them, to deliberate them in our mind. And then when we do so, it all starts to come together. But it's a gradual process. So take this very much as an encouragement. So this is quite a heavy session in the sense of Dhammānupassana. But it's a good thing, because sometimes we really need to get the bigger picture and see how things fit together, and then come back to it. So we let it sink in. After this session today, we let it sink in, go away, maybe have a look at it. We can look at the different tables of things, and then come back to it again. So having understood that, we come back to the table that we used at the beginning. So this was all the 30 elements that are so-called, I guess, unwholesome, that lead to birth, aging, and death. So at the start, we were saying lobha is this. Lobha is you lack the, you lack moral shame, you're disrespectful, you lack conviction, there's restlessness, no wish to see noble ones, forgetful, unwise contemplation, sakkaya ditthi, identity view, and then, you develop more lust or greed. So with this is one ñāṇapathā, and it's not an easy one. This is lobha path, raga. Then you have the dosa, and then you have the moha. So what we did during this session is really to look at the groups of 3. So we went by rows. But when you look by column, these are also insight pathways. And it's just good to know that there is links that create lobha. There are links that create dosa, and there's links that create moha. They do link up with sattārahara. So going the bad ways, you can see how these things also, how they're placed. But that's also quite, need to actually study that quite a lot. But I just want to give, particularly for this particular page before we end the session, is actually to look at how it actually links, to give you an idea of what the Buddha is saying by Loba track, Dosa track, and then Moha track. So with this, if we don't have a sense of shame, and the other thing to say is you can meditate just on one link at a time. That's also possible, because you can see quite a lot just by taking one link, any of these links really, especially applying it to something that's happened in the world, what's happening with you in the world, you can actually see it more quickly. So you start off with the lack of moral shame. So because you're shameless, you don't care about, noble ones. You don't care about disrespecting Buddha Dhamma. It's really this don't care attitude. You have this disregard. And so when you have this disregard, there's no way that you have any sort of saddha towards Buddha Dhamma Sangha. Or in any case, it's limited because you're raising things other than Buddha Dhamma Sangha higher. You see more truth in the world than truth in what the Buddha's teaching. And therefore, the mind is always restless because it's always imbued with worldly things. It's trying to gain something from the world, whether it's reputation, whether it's money, wealth, assets, all kinds of success, popularity. And so you don't want to see noble ones who are going to tell you, actually, you're in danger. And so you don't want to go and see noble ones who will tell you that, what you're doing is wrong, that you're cultivating akosala, for example. And so when it comes down to this muddasacha, this forgetfulness, then if you're very worldly, you have no way of knowing what is the truth. And so you just keep indulging and keep tolerating. And for one in Dhamma, well, you forget, you get lost in the world from time to time. And so you don't carefully, when you come to ayoniso manasikara, you don't carefully direct the mind. In fact, you're prone to spend most of the time in ayoniso manasikara, and only from time to time, maybe during certain sessions or only during the meditation time period, you might go to yoniso manasikara if you apply the right medicine, if you can come to the right view. And as a result of that, you're breeding the wrong view about this body and the wrong views about many, many things. And so when that happens, in particular, your view is more about worldly things, sensual desires, the physical nutriment, wanting to get more. And so there's always this longing. And so you burn with the lust. So this is a way of looking broadly at a top level of this is the ñāṇapathā for Loba. And so when it comes to dosa, what this is saying, you have no fear of wrongdoing. So you don't have any fear of the consequences of wrongdoing. You don't fear unwholesome karma. You don't fear being reborn in a bad destination. And so when someone comes and tries to instruct you, you tell them off, you turn away, you're very stubborn around it, even though they're trying to tell you for good reason, maybe even try to save you from lower realms. And in a sense, what happens after that is what you are encouraging in your own sense is stinginess, your Dhamma views, your views about worldly things, or your views about worldly things. So if you think you have the correct Dhamma, then you refuse to even listen. So it's not even accepting what someone says, but refusing to listen. And so there's a stinginess that keeps growing, particularly Dhammamacharya. And so when that's the case, then you're happy with your immorality. Sounds strange, but you're happy with the lack of virtue. You're happy to indulge in bad speech, bad actions, the wrong view, the wrong inclination, wrong intentions. And so you don't wish to hear the noble Dhamma. You don't want to be corrected. You don't want to be blamed for having, done wrong things. And so you're lost in the world. When you come to Sampajanya, you're very lost in the world. And even though things are sliding, you're still convinced that the worldly things are what's going to make you happy. And so you keep following the wrong path. And even in Dhamma, the wrong path in practice, because you think, if I abide in this higher concentration, even though there is this dullness, even though I keep having to reconstruct it, it's still good for me. And so you doubt what Buddha says, you doubt, the Buddha's teachings. Instead, you go towards other teachings And in a worldly sense, you could be going towards things that are only temporary happiness. But you get angry, the hatred comes in when it doesn't last, when it keeps breaking down. So that's the daughter path. And the moha path is when you have pamada, that you're very negligent. It doesn't matter what you do, that you're frivolous, you're not serious about this life in the sense of you want to have as much fun as possible. And even around spiritual path, maybe you only convinced and compelled part of the time. And so you indulge with friends. In a worldly sense, this is like, I'm going to live for the now. I'm going to live like this. Having, no sila is okay, no truth is okay. In Dhamma, it might be, part of the time I'll practice, part of the time I'll go and have fun. And then indolence sets in because you're tolerating, this negligent portion of life. And so you're indulging during those times of indolence. You're happy with your sense pleasures. You're happy with the wrong mindset. And so you don't restrain. And when you don't restrain, there's something in the fault-finding mind that even reproaches oneself. Because, when you go from indolence to lack of restraint, there is sadness that arises even when you get what you want and it doesn't last. Sadness arises when it ends. And when you can't get it, you get sad. But then even with this fault-finding mind, you actually do blame yourself internally. In Dhamma, you do this. I'm not good enough. I fell with my sila. I shouldn't have done that. What is wrong? All these kinds of thoughts. There's this uparamba citta. And so you do get quite upset. You get upset with the world. You get upset with one's practice. You worry about not being able to reconstruct what you thought was sukha, even the higher concentrations. And so with the weak mind, because the mind hasn't got to the right view or goes in and out of right view, then the mind gets dull most of the time rather than bright most of the time. And so you allow different ideas and different, things to set in where you believe the wrong things are still going to liberate you and make you happy. And so there's a huge lot of delusion here. And so this is a summary of Lopa Dosa Moha. And then we have also the Aloba Dosa Moha. I don't think I'll go through that. I think there's a lot of the Dhamma there anyway. So this gives you an idea about Tayodhamma Sutta and how we can actually look at certain things and even how we have started to cultivate certain things and areas where, for some of us, we might diagnose this is where we fall short. This is where we can improve. This is where we can put some attention to this. I think that's one of the things about Tayodhamma Sutta is that if you go away from this session interested in looking at, how it all groups together, the individual elements, the insight pathways, the ñāṇapathā, then it's a very good thing because you start to unlock certain things, start to get interested, and start to see also how things are working well. So when you go to this one that we haven't been through, the abandoning side, you start to see, there are certain qualities that are actually quite strong in some of us. Each person is different in the amount of time that they have for Dhamma practice, in the amount of time that they have to investigate the Buddha's teaching, and also in terms of the qualities that have been cultivated and supported, by oneself or by others around. But it's very good to look at this and also to see, I have been doing this, and that's why it's leading to this, to this, to this. And so this is another way of diagnosing and then deciding where can I put my attention. So I'll leave the Dhamma talk itself here, and I'll open